A really fun kind of special version of particles are grains, so those interacting tiny spheres here. And since Houdini 17, there's a new and rather easy and fun way to set those up. So let's do that by first dropping down a GeoNode as always, diving in there, and this time I want to import a file, which I then want to turn into those spheres. For that, I'm going to use a file node, drop that down, and then I downloaded a 3D scan from the quite amazing free site 3dscans.com. I poly-reduced it a bit, and I'm just going to load it up here. So it's this haunt C-star reduced here. Zooming out a bit, that's my initial geometry here. To set up my grains, all I have to do is drop down a vellum configure grain, and by hitting shift and enter, it's going to be automatically wired beneath our C-star. In here, I'll check create points from volume, and what worked well for me was a grain size of 0.02, but now you can see those grains are distributed irregularly, so they can form those odd effects here, just like these steps. And to counteract that, I'm just going to check jitter scale, which will relax those points a bit randomly, and this will take a while. And down here, you can see Houdini status bar, so lower left corner, you can always see what Houdini is doing. And if it's doing something that you don't want and it takes too long, just hammer escape and it'll stop. Also, if there's something taking forever and you rather want to dial in parameters and don't want to recook the whole setup, which can sometimes take time, you can always switch from auto update to manual update, for example, down here. Okay, configured my grains. Now let's drop down a vellum solver like this. Again, shift and enter to wire it up, wiring in those 3 slots here. And we have a bunch of free tutorials on vellum, so you might want to consult them, as well as a premium course. Just going to give you a quick rundown here. Going to dial back the constraint iterations. For grains, we don't need them, as well as the smoothing iterations. However, we're going to need a few substeps. Let's use 16 substeps here. That's just a setting for grains. Grains is a bit special case for vellum. Also, in the simulation tab, I want to increase my cache size to maybe 25 gigabytes, depending on how much RAM you have in your machine. And I want to check the ground plane. So let's just enable the ground position. And yeah, that is looking fine. So let's zoom out a bit and just go to frame 100 and let this simulation run. Again, you can see what it's doing down here. It's going to take a while. If you want to cancel this, just hammer escape. So after a few minutes, we arrive at this here. Let's just toggle real time, reset this, and let it play once. And what I wanted here is to reach a state where all those particles have settled, which is around frame 72. And to get the text on there and being perfectly mapped onto this final state here, I want to use a trick. So I want to drop down a time shift node, and into this time shift node I'll wire in my particles here and set this time shift node just by shift control clicking in here so that it always is on the frame 72, so when the simulation has settled. So no matter where I am now in my simulation, this will always result in frame 72 being passed on. And onto this frame, I'm gonna drop down a UV texture, setting up a UV map. And as you might have guessed, the UV map in Houdini is nothing more than a UV attribute, which in this case is a vector of 3. Let's set this to be on the points, as these are points rather than geometry using vertices. And let's make sure it points in the y-axis. So now I've set up a flat projection from the top. Next, let's drop down an attrib from map, which is the easiest way to texture points. In the image settings, I just want to invert B, so that my image sits upright. And you can see my grid is slightly distorted, so in the UV texture, let's dial in the scale, maybe like so, just eyeballed it. Next, in the attrib from map, I don't like this test texture here. I'd rather select something nice, so I'm just gonna select this garish Entagma logo here, hit accept, and in the attrib from map, let's maybe scale it. And contrary to what you'd think, the scale is actually the repetitions, so the higher this number, the smaller my actual image here. Let's translate it so it sits a bit more centered, maybe like so. Okay, so this is the final state I want to reach. Let's just move this over here. What do I do to apply this texture to the moving points now? What I have to do is to apply these UV texture coordinates that I generated here. Let's do this using a point VOP. It can be done in vex in a single line as well, but I promised you no vex or as little vex as possible. Let's wire in the particles, the live particles, coming in the first slot, and the UV texture to the second slot. Let's dive in there. And in here, what I want to output is a UV texture, and that's done using a bind export. So anything that you don't find on here by default, you can export using a bind export. Let's set this up to be a vector of 3, and let's call it UV, like so. And in here, I can wire the new UV coordinates. And I just want to copy them over from these points coming into the second slot here. And to access the UV attributes coming into the second slot, I'm going to use an attribute import, and as they are point attributes, I'm going to use an import point attribute node here. In here, let's set this up to import the UV attribute, and under file, let's wire this to the second input slot. So those op inputs are the first, second, third, and fourth input slot. Finally, I need to wire out the point numbers, and as I want to transfer the UV attribute from the points with the same point number, just coming into the second input slot, I can just directly wire in the point number to my first points point numbers as well. So the result goes out into the UV coordinates, and let's go up one level and rewire the attrib from map to this, reset this, and hit play. Pretty much what I expected. So this timeshift node is extremely powerful. You can work with expressions in there, you can animate the frames that you're accessing there. It's basically a time machine for a whole 3D animation. So what you'd normally do in an editing software such as Premiere or Final Cut or DaVinci, or in a compositing software such as Nuke or After Effects, just time stretching, time remapping, can be done with your 3D animation directly inside of Houdini. Let's just save this, and in the next tutorial talk a bit about rendering. If you guys like what we're doing and want to support us, you might want to head over to our Patreon, and we'd like to thank all of our patrons, especially Refik Anadol, Chris Hebert, Important Looking Pirates, Encore VFX, Patrick Fillion, and Gearbox Studio Quebec. Thanks so much, guys.